Blah, I want to suck your dick.
For whatever reason, I've been fixated lately on public domain and basically public domain characters who appear in both the Marvel and DC universes. Like, for instance, DC have their own version of Thor, who's depicted as kind of a jerk-ass meathead. I think it's funny that if James Gunn wanted, he could make his own Thor movie with the other Hemsworth, and there's not much Disney could do about it. He's already making his own DC Frankenstein movie with David Harbour playing the monster in the lead role for the upcoming Creature Commandos, which is kind of the Suicide Squad meets the Monster Fuck.
That monster sucked and fucked.
You know that both universes even have their own Popeye? DC's is renamed Captain Strong, a muscle-bound sailor they created to answer the question of what might happen if Popeye fought Superman. Marvel just called theirs Popeye the Sailor Man, like, what are you going to do about it? Sue Disney? They're probably the world's most successful copyright trolls. Anyway, one figure who I think is especially interesting is Count Dracula, King of the Vampires.
The Vatican wants to wet me up with silver bullets, but I'm on a goddamn samurai pill.
I think it's funny how he's kind of a C-tier villain in both continuities. Like in the DC Comics canon, he died of a sunstroke trying to drink Superman's blood. And over in Marvel, despite having been the headliner of the comic series that birthed Blade, he's not even the Daywalker's main rival. Now, comic book continuity is unwieldy. I know that if I pick a DC and a Marvel comic to review, I'm going to pick the wrong ones. It's going to be an Elseworld story or something, or maybe something that was retconned out of the canon later on. So, in looking for a fair comparison between the Marvel and DC Draculas for the purpose of this video, I'm looking for something self-contained and more or less standalone. And I think Blade Trinity and Batman vs. Dracula, which were feature-length films released within a year of each other in the mid-2000s, featuring the Count going up against a beloved vampire-ish superhero, both fit the bill. Blade Trinity. I put this movie off for almost 20 years because I always heard it was awful, and I gotta say it's not that bad. I'll go further and say that if you think there's more than a half a dozen MCU films that are any good, you don't have the bona fides to trash this movie. Admittedly, Trinity is by far the least of a trilogy that set a very high bar, but most of what I don't like about it comes down to features of the nu metal cinema era, which have, in some areas, come around to be kind of charming in retrospect, like the PlayStation 2 CGI, the dated music, and everyone wearing bondage gear. But it's got all the stuff I really hate about nu metal cinema too, like how action scenes are edited in a montage style, so while we're watching the main event, a climactic sword fight with Blade and Dracula, we're also cutting back and forth with a fight scene we don't really care that much about between Triple H and Dane Cook, but at least they kept the shaky cam to a minimum. In any event, if film professors can forgive Birth of a Nation for being a product of its time because they don't have the patience to watch Battleship Potemkin instead, then I think we can tolerate movies being shot and edited like music videos. It starts off with a vampire task force digging Dracula up from his tomb and half of them getting their heads ripped off for the trouble. They call him Drake, and I found him to be a bit of a disappointment. He never quite comes across as Dracula, more like a daddy dom at a BDSM dungeon that specializes in cuck scenes. But I do really like his Devilman form he uses in the final fight scene with Blade. He looks like he could be a monster on the Guyver, like a Screaming Mad George creation or something. And I really like this scene where he wanders into a Dracula store. I guess if Hello Kitty stores exist, then Dracula stores aren't too much of a stretch. I think this is a fun idea, taking a character like Dracula and putting him in a world where he's a pop culture figure. They don't do a whole lot with it here, but they did more with it than Renfield did with it. Also, this Dracula can walk around in the daylight. Bram Stoker's Dracula had no problem with the sun. That's a gimmick that began with Nosferatu. And I guess it's like a genetic mutation in the Blade verse. See, that's the kind of thing they could have really dug into. Genetic evolution, mirroring cultural evolution, but feels more like a hand wave than it does like a point. Since the subject of Blade Trinity probably won't come up in another review, I want to say I'm 100% Team Wesley. I think the director deserved to get choked the fuck out. Wesley Snipes built that franchise, and the studio put him in a position where he had to fight for control of his own movie. I think Wesley more than earned veto power over any other creative decision maker on any Blade project. He didn't like the script, and he didn't want David S. Goyer directing it, and I think that should have been his prerogative. It looks like the rights holders agree with me, because that's what has kept the new Blade movie from going into production, is Mahershala Ali's disappointment with the script. I feel Patton Oswalt was unfair to Wesley Snipes in his assessment of the situation, but I won't push that issue too far, because I know he's friendly with the Red Letter Media guys, and I daydream about getting to work with them someday. Anyway, Dracula's not as much of a centerpiece in this film as I was hoping him to be. He's a fairly basic mid-2000s action movie baddie. It feels like they were tasked with coming up with Dracula for a Blade movie without even knowing that Dracula actually predates Blade in the Marvelverse. But to be fair, he does have a few interesting quirks.
They don't know anything about honor or living by the sword, not like you and I do.
He's got this Klingon sense of honor, confessing admiration for Blade after their duel, and warning him that the thirst always wins. You see in the ending with Blade's eyes photoshopped onto his face because he wouldn't even open them for the scene? That was a deleted scene. The actual ending has Blade transforming into Dracula, who used his shape-shifting powers to impersonate Blade as a parting gift, allowing the real Blade time to safely escape the police. It's neat how Dracula sees a kinship in Blade that he doesn't see in his own underlings, and there's a running theme that modern-day vampires are these scurrying, parasitic cockroaches. I think every version of Marvel's Dracula is based on the idea that he was the same guy as Vlad the Impaler, so he sees himself as a warrior, a conqueror, not merely some scraggly survivor of a long-forgotten golden age. So there's some cool stuff here, but it's kind of undercooked. And I guess the biggest issue is that for a Blade movie, it feels like they spend a lot more time on Jessica Biel and Tosh Point than they did on Blade. If I had it my way, I'd say they should use this movie as a starting point for the Mahershala Ali reboot. You've got Blade versus Dracula, so make that the central focus of the film. It should be like a samurai movie with vampires in it. I think it's funny that they picked a long-haired Attitude Era wrestler to play a vampire in this movie, and it wasn't any member of the Brood.
As soon as that camera is off, he gonna fuck that little dog.
Batman versus Dracula. I guess this movie is based on the animated series The Batman, which I never got around to watching, because to me it felt like not a big enough departure from the animated series. I thought The Brave and the Bold was more fun, going in that Adam West direction. Anyway, just like Blade Trinity, Batman vs. Dracula: Dawn of Justice starts with someone digging up Dracula's tomb, which happens to be located in the Gotham Cemetery, which a flashback explains is because someone probably moved it there.
It seems after I was vanquished, my remains were relocated far from Transylvania.
It's Penguin who cracks the coffin open, having raced Joker to it after both of them were led to believe there was some treasure hidden here by a fellow inmate at Arkham Asylum. A neat thing in the first act here is how Batman and Dracula get the first hints of one another, with Batman telling Alfred about an encounter he had with these attackers who could only possibly be vampires, and Dracula, learning of a crime fighter dressed as a bat, remarks on how far his influence has spread.
My legacy has been quite influential.
Once we see Dracula restored to a less emaciated form, he looks a lot more Dracula-ish than Drake did in the Blade movie, and even calls his vampire servants his creatures of the night. This movie really touches on the hallmarks you want from a Dracula movie. You got him in human form, whining and dining Gotham's elite. He's wearing a red cape, and he's got the Jack Nicholson hair. When Bruce and Dr. Alucard meet at a fancy party, they immediately develop this weird mutual fascination with one another, with Alucard praising the solar power system Bruce Wayne has developed, and Bruce Wayne doing some of the greatest detective work I've ever seen in a Batman story. Pretty soon word gets out that some jerk dressed as a bat is going around attacking people, and it's Batman that takes the blame for it. So just like Blade, Batman's got to contend with the cops and the vampires. Now, where I think the movie gets really interesting is in the fact that Dracula hasn't actually killed anyone by the time Batman is throwing garlic-laced batarangs at him and trying to find a cure for vampirism.
I really hate to waste a life when it can be spent in servitude.
Now, sure, Batman's out to protect the people of Gotham and everything, but it's almost as if he isn't concerned so much with eradicating what he views as a public menace, but putting a stop to Dracula's influence, both cultural and genetic. And when he rejects Dracula's offer of kinship, the Count declares that there's only room for one Batman in this town.
Join me, Batman. Join my legion of the undead.
Not interested.
So what we've got here is as much a brand war as it is a personal feud.
Try as you may, you cannot outbat me.
These two are 7-Up and Sprite. The relationship between these two reminds me of a Michael Mann movie like Manhunter, where adversaries will share an understanding of one another that civilians aren't privy to. Bruce's frequent neglect of Vicky Vale in favor of capturing and experimenting on a schizophrenic clown is straight out of Heat. The whole Joker subplot is fantastic, by the way, from Joker prying into Penguin's business about hidden treasure to vampire Joker skittering along the walls to his drinking Batman's blood, first grateful, then impatient come feeding time.
Patsy, you complete me. It's about time, Patsy!
Bruce's experiments pay off with a cure for vampires in which he unleashes on Dracula's goons, the Lost Ones, while the Penguin and the Count drain Vicky Vale's life force to resurrect Dracula's dead wife. The fight in Dracula's catacombs eventually spills out into the Batcave. From the writing to the visual design, this movie is comprehensively focused on parallels between Batman and Dracula. And this crash through the wall is like those two parallel lines actually meeting in the middle.
What's up? That's what I'm trying to figure out. Is there a problem? Let me know. Let me know if there's one. No, you let me know, cause I'm here. So am I. I'm here for eternity, big dog. So am I. How about this? How about this? On God, you won't touch me. Oh, okay. On God. Okay, on God.
And here we find Batman to be the true apex predator when Dracula corners him in the cave and discovers that Batman can survive in Dracula's world, but Dracula cannot survive in Batman's, as he unleashes the solar power system the Count had been admiring earlier. And God, there's some great storyboarding here as we see Batman with his back to a man-made sun, a daywalker, capable of destroying a Dracula or feeding a Superman. As the survivors are rounded up and the news crew starts reporting, we get this really interesting shot here with Batman leaping into frame, and we see his silhouette and his shadow moving in perfect sync, confusing the viewer for just a moment with the illusion of looking at Batman and Dracula together once more. You know, I finished Blade Trinity saying I wanted a more focused, coherent version of this story, and wow, here it is. So, which movie's better? Batman vs. Dracula, by a lot. A lot of what I've been praising this movie for is its themes and aesthetics, and if that makes it sound a bit dry, well, it's not. The best thing about the movie is Tom Kenny as the Penguin, serving Dracula in a Renfield capacity. It's not 100% clear to what extent Cobblepot has been brainwashed, and to what extent he just always has a good time being a bad guy.
You like? It's a plasma screen. You know, as in blood.
I guess I need to mention other Batman vs. Dracula movies here. First, you got the Andy Warhol movie, considered lost for decades. The only publicly available footage suggests an abstract, experimental piece that's not so much entertaining as it is conceptually interesting. That is to say, not interesting. And there's a lost Filipino movie, Batman Fights Dracula. Batman's fought Dracula in the comics a number of times, but of course he has. Batman's fought everyone in the comics. More interesting than any Batman-Dracula crossover in the comics, I think, is the fact that one of Batman's earliest villains, predating the Joker, predating Batman's no-kill rule, and even predating Gotham City, was Mad Monk, aka Nikolai Tepes, debuting in Detective Comics number 31. Like this version of Dracula, Mad Monk's main power is hypnosis, using it on Bruce Wayne's fiancée, Julie Madison. The story sees Batman following the vampire to his home turf and shooting him to death in his sleep. Not as clever as a solar-powered sun bomb, but it gets the job done. With his red robe and hood, Mad Monk is distinctively non-Dracula-esque in his design, as if they were deliberately avoiding overlap with the Dracula illusions in Batman's design and trying to find a new approach to design a vampire overlord. Thanks to DC Comics genius Alex Jaffe for helping me out with this video. Listen to his podcast in the description. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe.